I want to put this into the context of where we are and where we must be. There are two Islamic radical revolutions taking place and seizing normalcy in the Middle East. That one radical Islamic revolution was started by Al-Qaeda 1.0 and is now continuing in the form of an Islamic state, okay? On the other side is a revolution that started in 1979 in Iran, in which the propagation of radical Shiite ideological revolution is also trying to seize control in the Middle East. The question for the international community is not what the United States or the European Union or Arab states are going to do. The question is whether or not there are core common interests among those who have good reason to oppose both revolutions, to be able to come up with a policy, leadership, as well as a strategy that is going to contain those two revolutions that are causing such havoc and harm in the Middle East, both to the people who live there, whether they live in Iran, whether they live in Iraq, whether they live in Syria or throughout the region, as well as the awful spread of radical jihadi terrorism in Europe and the United States and elsewhere. Now, with all of the debate that takes place, the fact of the matter is that you have to parcel out and determine what our core national interests are of Europeans, allied Arab states, and Americans. The problem is that in the Middle East right now, there is no effective leadership and grand strategy to deal with both. Those who have supported the Iran nuclear agreement have done so for both, I would argue, naive as well as very strategic and practical reasons. The practical reason, of course, is to delay Iran from being able to obtain a nuclear weapon for at least 10 years. In some respects, Mr. Kerry and the Obama administration would have liked to convince the world that Iran has irredeemably and irrevocably given up any aptitude for being able to produce a weapon. It's important for us to understand that is not the case. Secondly, what was most glaring in the fault of the Iran nuclear agreement negotiation was the failure of the Obama administration and its European allies to incubate that agreement with a regional strategic policy to effectively prevent Iran from being able to continue to wage as proxy wars in Syria and Yemen and elsewhere and to support terrorism without there being adequate penalty for continuing policies that were contrary to American and European core national security interests. Now, you can argue, as the administration would like to argue, the Iran nuclear agreement needed to stand alone. It needed to, in effect, be put on a pedestal. The fact of the matter is that the Iran nuclear agreement, in the absence of a containment strategy that is not an American endeavor alone, but European as well as our Arab allies, is in and of itself a license for Iran to continue its policies. I just wrote a piece that was published in the Huffington Post a few days ago about Iran's efforts to continue to destabilize Iraq. Now, it is not by accident that Iran has escalated its role in Yemen to destabilize a pro-Western regime that the United States and the Saudis are trying to replace and remove the Houthi rebels. It is not by accident that there are 3 divisions of Revolutionary Guards fighting in Syria. It is not by accident that Iran has escalated the financial support that it is providing Hezbollah and Hamas. It is not by accident that the Ayatollah and his government have escalated their ballistic missile tests in contravention to the United Nations Security Council resolutions. And it is not by accident that the Iranian regime's policy is to increase its repression at home for fear that the Iran nuclear agreement may usher in a vehicle of Western investment that could undermine the revolution, the Islamic revolution at home. Now, for those of us who have to look at the Middle East in the trajectory of what it means for our core interest in the next 10 years, the United States is not on the cusp of providing any strategic leadership based on what I see going forward. There is no effective policy that right now suggests that the United States has a containment policy to incubate the Iran nuclear agreement in order to prevent Iran from using both the political, geostrategic, military, and financial interest that it has to create the very vaunted Shiite crescent that it wishes to, in effect, create across the Middle East from Tehran to Lebanon. It is not a theoretical impossibility, but now increasingly a probability. Let's just take the case of Iraq, where one would at least believe that the Iranian regime has every incentive to supporting the Abadi government's efforts to defeat ISIS and restore a degree of normalcy in a country that has been racked by incredible terrorism in recent days. What my article suggests is quite to the contrary, that the Shiite militia directly under the control of the Iranian government, which, by the way, I submit was directly responsible and has been responsible for the latest attacks on Camp Liberty, which have not generated sufficient malarrangement against those who have been responsible for this and for the type of condemnation that is necessary, that Iran's militias are literally following in the wake of the Iraqi military's liberation of Fallujah, Ramadi, and other cities, and engaging in its sectarian violence and retribution in order to stir up further Sunni anger and animosity. Why, you may ask? Doesn't that sound counterintuitive? It's because, in the end, the Iranian government has territorial designs on the regime that go far beyond Baghdad itself. I do not make this up. It is indeed very much clear to us who follow Iran's designs in the region that this is part and parcel of its efforts ultimately create that very necessary alliance between a Shiite regime in Iraq and a Shiite regime in Syria. Now you say what's standing in its way, it's ISIS. And indeed, the Iranian government sees the continuation of the Assad regime as the front line in its efforts to defeat ISIS, which its propaganda machines relentlessly churn out as the #1 evil in the world, replacing temporarily the great Satan, the United States, and the little Satan, Israel. But what is essential here for us to understand in the role that Iran is playing without there being a counterweight is that our Sunni Arab allies, such as Jordan, such as our Gulf state allies, Egypt, let alone Israel, have very good reason to question what will happen if, in the end, the American fatigue with the Middle East, the pivot that the Obama administration has desperately tried to, in effect, impose on a policy and transform itself away from the Middle East to Asia, and yet finds itself eye-dropping troops and policy into dealing with Syria and Iraq. What is one to make of the fact that the world is lacking an effective leadership policy to deal with both ISIS and Iran? I would wrap up by saying the following. As much as I agree with the panelists I do think that the next president of the United States, whether it be Mrs. Clinton or, God help us, Mr. Trump, okay, it's not merely a question of ratifying and abiding by and holding Iran accountable for its nuclear agreement adherence. No, that's the easy part. The hard part is to help foment the type of democratic change inside Iran in order to keep the Iranians focused on their internal challenges rather than spreading their revolution throughout the Middle East. Now, I'm not one to suggest to you that I have a direct answer about how one foments democratic change in Iran. But their mischief in the Middle East deserves a very effective counter-response. And it's essential that we have a strategy and a policy to have the Ayatollah worry exactly what he should be worried about, which is not how he's going to expand his revolution and his cause into Iraq and Syria, but in effect have to worry about the rightful democratic aspirations of the people in Iran. Thank you.